It all started with something so small, yet so invasive, that it sent shockwaves through the entire neighborhood. Imagine walking outside and realizing that someone had taken it upon themselves to cut the lock off your own property, without permission, without warning, and without a single ounce of remorse. That's exactly what happened here. A homeowner's Jeep wasn't just tampered with, it was snatched right out from under them, all because one overzealous HOA figure believed she had the right to decide what belonged where. But what she didn't know was that this particular Jeep wasn't just any vehicle. Her reckless grab set off a chain of events she never saw coming. The question is, how far would she go and how badly would it backfire? Before the chaos, before the cutting of locks, and before the storm that would shake the entire neighborhood, life for one homeowner seemed steady and predictable. Let's step into their world, because to truly understand the shock of what came later, you first have to see what normal looked like. The neighborhood itself was the kind you'd see in a glossy brochure: rows of tidy houses with manicured lawns, neighbors who waved politely when passing, and an HOA that promised community standards and property value protection. For the most part, it felt safe, clean, and reliable. Families moved here because they thought it would be a shield against the chaos of the outside world. And at first, that's exactly what it seemed to be. Our main resident was someone who believed in order, in responsibility, and in minding their own business. They were the type to pay their bills on time, keep their yard trimmed, and respect the rules. This wasn't a troublemaker, and that's what makes the coming storm so much more unsettling. They lived quietly, parking their Jeep in their designated space, commuting to work, and enjoying evenings on the porch. For them, the HOA was just background noise, a line on a monthly bill and the occasional newsletter stuffed in the mailbox. But in every community, there are certain figures who live for the power the HOA offers. For most, the rules are guidelines, a way to keep things fair. For others, the rules are weapons. And in this neighborhood, there was one figure who stood out, someone whose name sparked a groan or an eye roll every time it was mentioned. She was nosy, confrontational, and convinced she was the keeper of order. If a trash can was left out past pickup day, she'd snap a photo. If a lawn grew half an inch too high, she'd file a complaint. She didn't see herself as difficult. In her mind, she was the neighborhood's savior. At first, our resident brushed her off. They'd hear stories of her picking fights with other homeowners, leaving warning notes on cars, and starting arguments about the smallest violations. It was frustrating, sure, but it wasn't personal. Or at least it hadn't been, yet. And that Jeep? To our resident, it wasn't just a vehicle. It was dependable, a workhorse that carried them through daily life. But unknown to most of the neighborhood, it also had a deeper tie, one that would eventually turn this dispute from petty HOA nonsense into something much bigger. That Jeep wasn't just a car sitting in a driveway. It was connected to something larger, something that should never have been touched. Still, in the beginning, it was parked quietly without issue. It didn't block traffic, it didn't spill onto anyone else's property, and it certainly didn't violate any real rules. But to the self-proclaimed enforcer of the HOA, even the smallest imagined offense could become fuel for battle. She had been watching, cataloging, and looking for an opportunity. The setup for the storm was subtle at first. A strange note appeared tucked under a wiper blade, a passive-aggressive message about compliance and community guidelines. There was no official citation, no board letter, just a piece of paper scrawled in sharp handwriting. It was the kind of thing you might shrug off, but also the kind of thing that lingers in the back of your mind. Then came the sideways looks. The subtle comments at HOA meetings about certain vehicles taking up space, about appearance standards that needed to be enforced more strictly. They weren't naming names, but everyone could tell the remarks were aimed at someone. The tension was building, even if most neighbors didn't realize it yet. This is how these disputes so often start, not with a dramatic explosion, but with a slow drip of irritation, an undercurrent of control, and the quiet scheming of someone who thinks the rules bend to their will. For the homeowner, life was still calm on the surface. They kept their head down, kept working, kept parking their Jeep the same way they always had. But under that surface, lines were already being drawn. Because when someone obsessed with control decides they don't like what you own, how you park, or where you live, it stops being about the rulebook. It becomes personal. And this was about to become very, very personal. The stage was set. The Jeep was in its usual spot. The homeowner was simply trying to live in peace. And the so-called enforcer of the HOA? She was about to make her move. What she didn't know was that the decision she made, the reckless action she took against that Jeep, would unleash consequences far beyond a simple neighborhood squabble. Because you can pick fights over lawns and mailboxes, but some things should never be touched. And once she crossed that line, there would be no going back. At first, it seemed like nothing more than idle annoyance. The Jeep sat quietly in its spot, no different than it had for months. The homeowner thought maybe the sharp note tucked under the wiper blade was just a one-off, another reminder of the neighborhood's self-appointed watchdog looking for control. But the following weeks revealed that this wasn't going to stop. It was only beginning. The first escalation came in the form of an official-looking letter from the HOA. Stamped with the association's logo and delivered with all the authority of a legal document, it claimed that the homeowner's Jeep was in violation of community standards. The reasoning? The letter was vague, something about the vehicle being unsightly and not in harmony with neighborhood aesthetics. No specific rule was cited, no clause was referenced. Just a blanket statement that seemed more like an opinion than an enforceable rule. For the homeowner, it was frustrating but not shocking. This was how these things started. Still, it left them unsettled. They had always followed the rules. They kept their lawn trimmed, paid their dues, and respected quiet hours. The Jeep was not abandoned, not broken down, not leaking fluids or blocking anyone's way. Yet suddenly, it had been targeted as a problem. The homeowner decided to ignore it at first. Maybe it would blow over, maybe the so-called enforcer would get bored and find a new target. But that was a mistake, because ignoring it only emboldened her. Within days, a second letter arrived. This one carried the threat of fines. If the Jeep was not removed or brought into compliance within 10 days, the homeowner would face escalating penalties. Again, the wording was murky, the justification non-existent. But the tone was harsher. It was no longer a warning, it was a demand. And soon, the harassment spilled beyond paper notices. The enforcer herself began making appearances. She would linger near the Jeep, taking photos with her phone, circling the vehicle as if documenting a crime scene. Neighbors whispered about how she'd been seen crouching by the tires, jotting things in a notebook. Some laughed it off as her being overzealous, but for the homeowner, it was invasive. Every time they walked outside, they felt watched, scrutinized, stalked. The next escalation came in the form of fines. Not just one, but several, piling up week after week. Each notice declared the Jeep non-compliant and slapped on a dollar amount that grew larger every time. It was clear, this wasn't about community harmony. This was personal. She had chosen the Jeep as her battleground, and she was determined to win. The homeowner pushed back, filing appeals, attending HOA meetings, and demanding clarification. But the board was stacked with people who either didn't care enough to get involved, or who sided with the enforcer out of fear of crossing her. Every attempt to reason was met with stone-faced indifference or dismissive remarks about rules being rules. It was a nightmare of red tape and arbitrary authority. The Jeep was fine, there was no real violation. But in this community, the perception of one powerful individual was enough to brand something a problem. And once branded, it was nearly impossible to undo. What made it worse was the way the fines began to affect daily life. Letters arrived almost weekly, threatening liens on property if payments weren't made. Neighbors started whispering, some siding with the homeowner, others quietly agreeing with the enforcer just to avoid her wrath. The Jeep, once just a mode of transportation, had become the center of a neighborhood standoff. But the harassment didn't stop with fines. The enforcer escalated again, this time more boldly. One morning, the homeowner stepped outside to find a bright orange sticker plastered across the windshield, the kind used for abandoned vehicles. The message screamed in bold letters, "Remove immediately or be towed." The homeowner was stunned. This wasn't just intimidation anymore, it was an outright threat. The Jeep wasn't abandoned, wasn't broken down, wasn't neglected. Yet here it was, labeled as if it had no right to exist in the neighborhood. Frustration turned to anger. The homeowner peeled off the sticker, marched to the next HOA meeting, and demanded answers. But once again, the enforcer twisted the narrative. She spoke of neighborhood standards, of safety concerns, and of the need to maintain order. To anyone listening, it sounded like empty justification. But to the board, it was enough to let her continue. The homeowner left the meeting with their blood boiling. It was clear, this wasn't going to be resolved by reason. She wasn't interested in fairness. She wanted control. And the Jeep, for whatever reason, had become her hill to die on. The next weeks became a battle of endurance. Every day brought a new note, a new photo, a new fine. The homeowner started to dread checking the mailbox, knowing another threat was likely waiting. Sleep became harder to come by, the constant stress weighing heavier with each passing day. What had once been a peaceful neighborhood now felt like a hostile territory. And then came the boldest move yet. One evening, after a long day, the homeowner returned home to find something chilling. The lock securing the Jeep had been cut clean through. The heavy-duty chain that had been wrapped around the steering wheel lay discarded on the ground. And the Jeep itself? It had been tampered with, moved slightly from where it had been parked. Panic surged through the homeowner. Someone had crossed a line. This wasn't just harassment anymore, it was trespassing, vandalism, and possibly theft. The only person bold enough, obsessed enough, to go this far was obvious. She had done it. The enforcer had made her move. At that moment, the homeowner realized the situation had reached a breaking point. It was no longer about letters, fines, or HOA meetings. It was about personal violation. Their property had been tampered with, their lock cut by someone who believed she had the authority to take what wasn't hers. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have anticipated, was the significance of that Jeep. It wasn't just a personal vehicle. It had ties she could never have imagined. And by touching it, by cutting that lock, she had set into motion consequences that would soon spiral far beyond her control. The homeowner stood there, staring at the broken chain on the ground, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. Anger, fear, and determination swirled together. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Because now the battle was no longer confined to HOA letters and petty fines. It had escalated into something much bigger, and the fallout was about to shake the entire neighborhood. Cliffhanger. What happens when an HOA enforcer crosses a line she can't take back? And what will unfold when the truth about that Jeep finally comes to light? The night the lock was cut was the night the balance of power shifted forever. For weeks, the harassment had built like a storm cloud, letters, fines, threats, and humiliation. But nothing compared to the sight of that chain, thick and heavy, lying on the asphalt like a severed lifeline. It wasn't an accident, it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate. Someone had walked up, bolt cutters in hand, and decided the Jeep no longer belonged to its rightful owner. The homeowner knew who had done it. Everyone knew. The HOA's self-appointed enforcer had crossed the line from petty control into outright criminal behavior. But what she didn't know, what no one else in the neighborhood realized, was that this wasn't just any Jeep. And the consequences of her arrogance were about to explode. The homeowner didn't panic. They didn't scream or rush to call the police. Instead, they stood silently, staring at the broken chain, their jaw set, their mind sharp. They knew what the Jeep represented. They knew what the enforcer had just triggered. And for the first time in weeks, they felt a strange calm. Because for the first time, the power wasn't hers anymore. The next morning, it began. Neighbors gathered in whispers, drawn by the commotion as two unmarked vehicles rolled slowly into the cul-de-sac. Men in plain clothes stepped out, stern, professional, radiating authority. They weren't the kind of people you argued with over trash cans or lawn heights. They were from the police task force, the very one the Jeep was tied to. The homeowner explained what had happened, how the Jeep had been locked, secured, and how someone had cut through it, attempting to interfere. The task force agents didn't take it lightly. They treated the Jeep as evidence, examining the lock, photographing the scene, and asking sharp, pointed questions. This wasn't an HOA squabble anymore. This was tampering with official property. And then came the confrontation. The enforcer, ever bold, stormed out of her house the moment she saw the activity. She marched across the street, arms folded, her voice raised in that self-righteous tone that had grated on neighbors for years. "What's going on here?" she demanded, glaring at the homeowner as though they were the problem. "This vehicle has been in violation for weeks. I told you it was non-compliant. It shouldn't even be here. I've documented everything." Her words, dripping with arrogance, carried through the air. She was confident, maybe even smug, believing she had the upper hand. She had no idea that her little crusade was about to unravel in front of everyone. One of the task force officers turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, are you the one who cut this lock?" The color drained from her face. For the first time she faltered. She stammered, backpedaling, insisting she had authority as part of the HOA to enforce rules. She claimed the vehicle was unsightly, that it was a nuisance, that she was protecting property values. Her voice rose with each excuse, growing more desperate, more shrill. But the officers weren't swayed. They didn't care about HOA guidelines or imaginary violations. What mattered to them was that official property had been tampered with. A secured vehicle, tied to law enforcement operations, had been violated because someone thought their personal interpretation of neighborhood rules trumped the law. The crowd of neighbors grew. They stood on porches and sidewalks, watching as the confrontation escalated. For weeks, many of them had been silent, afraid of becoming targets themselves. But now, with authority present, their silence broke. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into bold statements. She's been harassing people for years. She fined me for leaving my car 2 inches over the line. She threatened to tow my son's truck. Voices rose, one after another, a chorus of grievances long suppressed. And with each word, the enforcer shrank further, her once unshakable authority crumbling in the open daylight. The officers listened, documenting, their stern expressions never softening. Then came the moment that flipped everything. "Ma'am," one officer said firmly, "tampering with this vehicle is a serious offense. This Jeep is tied to an ongoing police task force operation. Cutting through its lock and interfering with it is not only unauthorized, it could be considered criminal." The silence that followed was heavy, electric. The enforcer's mouth fell open, but no words came. The weight of what she had done settled on her shoulders. It wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. It was bigger. Much bigger. The homeowner watched, their chest tight, emotions swirling, anger, vindication, and no small amount of relief. For weeks they had been painted as the problem. For weeks they had endured fines, humiliation, and harassment. But now the truth was undeniable. The enforcer wasn't the protector of the neighborhood. She was its biggest liability. Neighbors gasped, some whispering in shock. Others smiled faintly, the satisfaction of long-awaited justice written across their faces. For so long, they had lived under her thumb, afraid of her notes, her fines, her relentless policing of trivial matters. But now, the balance of power had shattered. The enforcer tried one last time to defend herself. She insisted she didn't know, that she was only trying to uphold the rules, that she was misunderstood. But her excuses fell flat. The officers weren't interested in her spin. They had evidence, the broken lock, the tampering, the testimony. And then the final blow came. One officer stepped closer, his voice low but carrying across the yard. "Ma'am, ignorance of the law is not an excuse. You had no authority to cut through this lock or tamper with this vehicle. The fact that you did so shows reckless disregard, and there will be consequences." The enforcer's face went pale. Her eyes darted around the crowd, searching for support but found none. Neighbors who once stayed silent now looked at her with open contempt. Her reign, her petty power, had collapsed in the span of minutes. The homeowner stood a few feet away, silent, steady. They didn't gloat, didn't shout. They didn't need to. The moment spoke for itself. The climax of the conflict had arrived, not with fists or shouting, but with truth, exposure, and the weight of authority pressing down on the very person who had abused it for so long. It was a turning point. From this moment on, nothing would be the same in the neighborhood. The fines, the threats, the harassment, it had all led here. And now the enforcer's actions were no longer just petty annoyances. They were matters of accountability, and she was the one under the microscope. The Jeep sat quietly, its presence more powerful than ever. What was once just a target for her obsession had become the symbol of her downfall. She had thought she was seizing control. Instead, she had cut into something she could never control. And as the task force officers prepared their next steps, one thought hung heavy in the air. If she was willing to go this far, how many other lines had she crossed in her quest for power? After the climactic confrontation, the neighborhood was left in a state of quiet disbelief. The once untouchable enforcer had been unmasked in front of her peers, with the law itself intervening in a way that no one could ignore. Yet for the homeowner, and for those who had witnessed years of petty rules, fines, and intimidation, the resolution was not instantaneous. It was a slow, meticulous unfolding of consequences, accountability, and eventual peace. The HOA board convened emergency meetings in the days following the incident. For weeks, discussions were heated and intense. The board members, many of whom had previously turned a blind eye to the enforcer's antics, now faced the stark reality that ignoring abuses of power could result in legal liabilities and neighborhood upheaval. There were debates about policy reform, rule clarification, and the responsibilities of those entrusted with enforcing guidelines. But one decision was unanimous: the enforcer could no longer maintain her position. A formal vote removed her from the board entirely. Her authority, once absolute in her own mind, was revoked. Official announcements were sent to every resident, carefully worded to emphasize accountability and fairness. No longer would fines or threats be handed down without transparent rules and proper documentation. The neighborhood had finally established boundaries that could not be crossed, reinforced by both legal oversight and community consensus. The homeowner, meanwhile, took steps to secure not just their property but their peace of mind. The Jeep was restored to its rightful condition, locks replaced with high-security measures, and the task force confirmed that no further interference would occur. For the first time in months, the vehicle could exist in the driveway without fear. More importantly, the homeowner regained a sense of control over their own life. But the consequences for the enforcer extended beyond mere removal from the board. Local authorities reviewed her actions and documented the tampering incident thoroughly. She faced fines and was required to attend mandatory mediation sessions to acknowledge the impact of her behavior. While she avoided criminal charges due to lack of prior offenses, her reputation in the community was irreversibly tarnished. Former allies quietly distanced themselves, neighbors openly criticized her past decisions, and she found herself isolated in the very community she had sought to dominate. For other residents, the events served as both cautionary tale and inspiration. Many who had previously felt powerless began attending meetings, voicing concerns, and engaging in neighborhood governance. The experience had sparked a newfound commitment to fairness and vigilance. Petty grievances that had once been ignored were now addressed openly and democratically, creating a healthier dynamic where enforcement was about maintaining order, not asserting personal authority. Neighborhood dynamics shifted dramatically. The removal of the enforcer allowed for more equitable decision-making. Community projects, previously hampered by her unilateral control, moved forward smoothly. Residents collaborated on landscaping improvements, street maintenance, and social events. There was a renewed sense of collective responsibility, a recognition that rules must serve everyone equally, not just those who wielded them. The homeowner's personal journey also offered a significant emotional arc. After months of stress, anxiety, and uncertainty, they emerged stronger, more assertive, and respected. The ordeal had tested patience, resilience, and resolve, forcing them to confront not only external harassment but also internal doubts about whether justice could prevail. By facing the situation head-on, they became a figure of quiet leadership in the community. Their experience became a reference point for neighbors grappling with conflicts, illustrating that standing firm against abuse of power could yield meaningful results. Interestingly, the Jeep itself became a symbol within the neighborhood. No longer merely a vehicle, it represented resilience, vigilance, and the triumph of fairness over arbitrary authority. Residents would sometimes joke about it, acknowledging the bizarre saga that had unfolded, but always with a sense of relief that the conflict had been resolved without irreversible harm. Even children in the neighborhood were aware of the story, a reminder that justice sometimes comes from patience and courage rather than confrontation alone. The HOA, now restructured with clear checks and balances, implemented multiple reforms. Written rules were clarified, complaint processes were standardized, and oversight mechanisms ensured that no single individual could wield unchecked power. Transparency became a cornerstone of community governance. Every decision, fine, and enforcement action required proper documentation, justification, and in some cases, public disclosure. The culture shifted from one of fear and intimidation to one of accountability and collaboration. One surprising effect of the conflict was the level of engagement it generated among neighbors who had previously remained detached. Meetings became well attended, with diverse voices contributing perspectives that had been absent before. Long-standing disputes, unrelated to the Jeep or the enforcer, were resolved more quickly because residents had learned the value of addressing issues constructively and collectively. Conflict became an opportunity for improvement rather than a source of personal power. From a broader perspective, the story of the Jeep incident spread beyond the cul-de-sac. Local blogs and community forums discussed the case, highlighting the dangers of unchecked HOA power and the importance of resident vigilance. Advice columns referenced the events as an example of how to navigate disputes while protecting personal property and legal rights. The narrative served as a guide for other neighborhoods, illustrating that even small, seemingly mundane conflicts could escalate dangerously if left unchecked. For the homeowner, the lessons were deeply personal. They realized the importance of documentation, clear communication, and timely escalation when facing unfair treatment. They also learned the value of measured restraint. Responding rashly could have complicated the situation, but thoughtful action, coupled with patience, allowed for a decisive and ultimately victorious resolution. Their story became an example of how courage paired with strategic thinking could overcome intimidation and unfair power dynamics. Emotionally, the resolution brought closure, but it also left lingering reflections. The neighborhood had witnessed firsthand how a single individual's obsession with control could destabilize a community. It underscored the fragile nature of civility when checks and balances are absent. Yet it also highlighted the power of collective awareness, legal protections, and moral fortitude. Residents were reminded that fairness is not automatic. It requires vigilance, participation, and, when necessary, courage to confront wrongdoing. The enforcer, now marginalized and closely monitored, served as a living reminder of the consequences of overreach. Her previous actions were cataloged in HOA records, referenced in meetings, and cited as justification for reforms. She could no longer manipulate situations for personal satisfaction without scrutiny. In this sense, accountability extended beyond punishment. It became a preventive measure for the community's future. Meanwhile, the homeowner found a renewed sense of belonging. The once hostile environment transformed into one of cautious optimism. Neighbors who had watched the saga unfold began sharing their own stories, creating a dialogue that had been absent for years. Relationships strengthened through collective experiences, trust was rebuilt, and a sense of shared responsibility emerged. The story of the Jeep and the enforcer's downfall also inspired broader conversations about neighborhood governance and residents' rights. Homeowners began advocating for clearer HOA guidelines, fair enforcement, and legal literacy regarding property and communal regulations. Workshops and information sessions were held, teaching residents how to document interactions, appeal fines, and assert their rights without escalating conflicts unnecessarily. Symbolically, the climax and its aftermath represented a victory not only for the homeowner but for the entire neighborhood. It illustrated that vigilance, courage, and adherence to principles could overcome arbitrary authority. The resolution reinforced the idea that fairness is maintained not by fear, but by accountability and transparency. Residents learned that power unchecked is dangerous, but power balanced by oversight and participation is constructive. As months passed, the neighborhood settled into a rhythm of normalcy. The Jeep remained in its rightful place, a quiet monument to resilience. The homeowner's life returned to its familiar routines: evening walks, community events, and a sense of security long absent. Yet the story lingered in conversation, a reminder of the extraordinary circumstances that had tested patience, resolve, and moral courage. In the end, the greatest impact was not the fines reversed or the lock replaced, but the lessons learned and the precedent set. The community had experienced the chaos of unchecked authority and emerged stronger, wiser, and more cohesive. Petty disputes no longer held the same weight because residents understood the mechanisms of accountability and the importance of addressing conflicts constructively. The homeowner, looking back, recognized that the ordeal had been transformative. They had endured stress, intimidation, and uncertainty, yet they had navigated the conflict with composure, strategy, and integrity. Their experience became a template for other residents, a guide for confronting unreasonable power while maintaining personal dignity and legal protection. As the sun set over the cul-de-sac, there was a sense of closure. The streets were quiet, the houses orderly, and the community engaged in a way that promised stability. Yet the story of the Jeep, the enforcer, and the lessons learned would remain a part of the neighborhood's history, a story told to caution, to inspire, and to remind residents that fairness and vigilance go hand in hand. Powerful takeaway line. In the end, it wasn't just a Jeep that was defended, it was the principle that no one, no matter how obsessed with power, can dictate what's right in a community where fairness, courage, and accountability prevail.